This sense of affirming this nation, even though the nation didn't affirm us, has been a part of African American history from the very beginning.
We are seeking genuine equality, where we are dealing with hard economic and social issues.
A dream realized. The fight for fair housing in North Lawndale. The American dream. Millions have come to America searching for it. Many have had to fight to make that dream a reality. North Lawndale, located on the west side of Chicago, has been home to many searching for the American dream. Originally home to Eastern European immigrants known as Bohemians, by the 1920s, it had become home to the third largest Jewish community in the world.
The early immigrants that came to the United States, the first wave tend to be the educated and the well-born. The second and the third waves tend to be the poorer people.
The Jewish residents of Lawndale were a product of the Great Depression in the 1930s and had experienced discrimination because of who they were. In the early 1900s and again starting in the 1940s, African Americans were leaving the American South in what became known as the Great Migration. Many were fleeing crippling segregation, violent lynchings, and the evil of Jim Crow.
I was born in Vicksburg, Mississippi. I was a part of the migration at that time. My family left the South when I was 4 years old. I was born in 1942.
You just had droves of people coming north. I mean, I grew up in Arkansas. Lots of other people were coming from Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, Texas, Tennessee. By 1930, the Black Belt, located on the south side of Chicago, was overflowing with residents. Due to the discriminatory practices of landlords and city government, there were only a few places blacks could settle in Chicago.
North Lawndale at that point was very heavily Jewish. There were some Bohemians still left in the neighborhood, but African Americans were generally still living on the south side, right? And that neighborhood was so crowded on the south side. So suddenly, as Jews started to become a little bit more affluent, wanting to buy houses in the suburbs, some of the houses then started to open up in North Lawndale, and many African Americans from the south side would start looking around, trying to find a nicer house.
In Chicago, between 1940 and 1960, the African American population grew from 278,000 to 813,000.
African Americans generally were not able to get mortgages or financing from banks if they were trying to buy a house. There were a variety of reasons why that was the case, but generally the housing market was very discriminatory. So you get a city like Chicago, and when African Americans started coming to the city of Chicago in large numbers in the early teens or the 1900s, the 1920s, following World War I, African Americans were only allowed to live in one very narrow part of the city on the south side.
Chicago was very different then than it is now, I will tell you. The communities in Chicago were very segregated.
I came to Lawndale, first of all, I came because I had two sisters who lived here, and I didn't have any money. I had an opportunity to make a conscious decision after I'd been here a while and saw things that were happening, and I decided that I would be a teacher. And when I went down to the Board of Education and was about to get an assignment, they described the kind of schools that were available. And one of the schools that was available that I could get a job at was in the heart of Lawndale. And they told me, says, this is a great opportunity, but it's a challenging opportunity. It sounded like a good challenge. People were everywhere. Everywhere you looked, there were people. There were so many young people, kids, until we didn't have enough classroom space for them. The community had become seriously overcrowded. Many of the hard-working African Americans arriving in Chicago faced a different kind of discrimination. New migrants were subject to restrictive housing covenant. These laws prohibited them from leasing or buying homes in certain neighborhoods because they were black.
Second and third generations of Jews who came in the late 1880s and 1890s, in the first part of the 20th century, they also suffered discrimination. But because their skin wasn't black, and because they could move in the next generation up, black people, even those of us who moved up, couldn't get out of the segregated neighborhoods we lived in. And so that there was a uniqueness of our unwelcome in the nation.
The Federal Housing Association denied loans to African Americans, making buying a home for newly arrived blacks almost impossible. The FHA designated areas with large black populations as red zones, meaning the properties were considered worthless. Banks refused to lend mortgage loans to anyone wanting to buy in a red-lined area.
The only way African Americans could really buy houses, for the most part, not only in Chicago, but in many other cities around the country, in Washington, D.C., and Baltimore, and Pittsburgh, and Cincinnati, and Cleveland, and Louisville, Kentucky, all over the country, African Americans bought houses on what's called land contracts.
Buying on contract meant someone gave you a rent-to-own agreement on a house. A renter would pay a monthly amount toward the overall price for the property. Once the price was paid off, the renter would then own the home. But the contracts were rarely in the renter's favor.
Jews lived in the community. A few Jews went around and said, the blacks are coming, you better sell.
One ambition of every white resident seemed to be to sell his house as quickly as possible and get out while the going was good.
Homes that were worth $15,000 were sold for $7,000 and $8,000, turned around and resold for $23,000 and $24,000.
Mr. and Mrs. Walter Clay are paying $22,500 for this, their two-story home at 37 Lexington Avenue. When they entered into the contract, the Clays were new to the business of house purchase, and they didn't understand that the actual value of the premises was only $14,000 or $15,000.
You do not own the home until the last payment is paid. And unfortunately, a lot of families fell in that trap because people couldn't obtain mortgages in the North Lawndale neighborhood.
Contract sellers preyed upon desperate black families who had little to no options.
Maybe it needed a new roof, maybe it needed a new furnace, and with the contract you were buying the house as is. So basically now you've got to pay a lot more to get the house than the white family. You've got to come up with a much bigger down payment, and then you have this onerous term on the contract where you're not going to develop any equity because you're not going to have the deed to the property. The seller is still holding the deed to the property.
These people had something to buy, they bought it, the investors, and now they have something to sell and they sold it. You're going to say because they made what is termed here excess profit. Immoral? I don't know if it is.
This is in the 1950s. Maybe you have a guy who's working at Campbell's Soup and he's making 50 cents an hour and he's got this $25,000 mortgage. So it becomes very difficult for families to sustain this process.
The house was worth $14,500. but he's showing me 20.
It got even more egregious in the sense that very often the sellers would kind of force the buyers or the homeowners into default so that they could get the house back and then resell it again for even more money.
In 1957, Albert and Sally Bolton, a black couple, went to see attorney Mark Sater. The Boltons purchased a house on contract in the Hyde Park area. Overcharged, the Boltons were taken advantage of and tricked out of their home after being late on one payment in 18 months. Mark Sater, a Jewish attorney originally from North Lawndale, took their case. Mark Sater filed a lawsuit on behalf of the Boltons. The lawsuit only succeeded in postponing the Boltons' eviction, but in researching for the case, Mark had uncovered a web of unfair housing practices based on fraud and racism. He estimated that through fraudulent fees and other discriminatory practices, contract sellers were making $1 million a day from black people in Chicago. Mark Sater published his findings and became an advocate for other black families who were the victims of fraudulent contract selling. Black communities under pressure from multiple factors slowly began to become slums.
America was very much a separate nation. It talked about liberty and justice and all that stuff, but it was pretty much a segregated, segmented country.
At the time, there were no tools for African Americans to actually own or get mortgages because the community was redlined. Based on FHA standards for our federal government, you would see red on the south and west sides of Chicago, and it would be a red that would be intense. Not only are there housing discrimination and redlining, but also the schools, and as well as the crime stats.
There was a substantial anti-racist movement in the school system that goes back 2, 4, 5 years. And they had the more activist members of this coalition of 33 groups in the city called for a school boycott.
Albert Raby, a teacher in the Chicago public school system on the west side of Chicago, saw a need to act.
He was a young guy. He was a substitute teacher. He was very militant, and he was a great leader. This event influenced, I think, Reverend King a good deal. You know, there was a movement.
In 1962, he helped form the Coordinating Council of Community Organization, fighting to end school segregation in Chicago. Albert became friends with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the premier civil rights activist in America.
King, being him who he is, wanted to see the good things that happened in the South extended to the rest of the country.
When King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference decided to take their fight for civil rights north, in 1966, they came to Chicago.
I would not say that the civil rights movement is dead. It's simply that we are moving to a new phase of the movement.
Impressed by the work of the CCCO, King teamed with Albert Raby to create a new organization. The Chicago Freedom Movement was a coalition between King's SCLC, Al Raby's CCCO, activist James Bevel, and more than 7 other civil rights organizations. Their mission was to end the urban slums in Chicago. I was teaching school, enjoying it, got involved in community life, and was offered the opportunity to be the executive director of the Greater Lawndale Conservation Commission, which was a neighborhood conservation group that was working to try and keep the community from deteriorating.
I met Jesse Jackson Sr. at an Omega party. And he was a leader of his frat, and I was a chapter, and I was a leader of my frat chapter. And when I was getting ready to come to Chicago to do that PhD at the University of Chicago, he and I talked about it. But Jesse's plan was that I would help him in Operation Breadbasket. And when he posed that to me, I couldn't say no, because I believed in everything, that Breadbasket and SCLC represented.
Change comes about when you can get with enough people who recognize that there is something we can do that alters the way things are. America was like a whirlwind of change. It was an exciting time to live, to be alive.
There were thousands and thousands and thousands of people who made the movement. Dr. King didn't make the movement. And he understood that. And he appreciated that.
Now we are in a new phase, and that is a phase where we are seeking genuine equality, where we are dealing with hard economic and social issues. And it means that the job is much more difficult. It's much easier to integrate a lunch counter than it is to guarantee an annual income. It's much easier to integrate a bus than it is to get a program that will force the government to put billions of dollars into ending slums.
His approach to this issue of housing and housing discrimination was generally focused on landlords and tenants, sort of tenants' rights issues. So he was fighting a process that he referred to as slum landlordism.
Slums is supposedly represent a condition. It's a situation that exists, and it has a lot of negative forces attributed to it. Slums.
As a show of solidarity, King, along with his wife Coretta, decided to live in one of the houses in North Lawndale.
Dr. King basically came to live in North Lawndale at 1550 South Hamlin to shed light on the deplorable housing conditions in the community in the North, where people thought that the North was the promised land.
1966 was the year I was discharged from the United States Army. On returning home to North Lawndale, Dr. King lived in our neighborhood. It completely turned me around from the person I was prior to meeting him to the person that I became as a result of meeting him.
Dr. King was a slum buster, because when you see him shoveling up, there's cleaning up around the building where he's living in, he was starting off doing that same thing, what we needed to be doing,
Minister Spencer Leak, his father, gave Spencer Leak Jr. his car, and we would take him to breakfast using Spencer Leak's car. He was a good man. He was a sharing person, always willing to talk to you.
I used to walk by the place where he lived and look up, and sometimes he'd come out on the balcony and holler down at us and speak. "How you boys doing?" We'd say, "We're doing fine, Dr. King. How are you? Y'all coming to the meeting tonight?" I went to the demonstrations. Some of us even tried to learn how to talk like Dr. King.
I weighed all of this. And as I weighed in it, as I prayed over it, something said to me that you got to speak on this issue.
In Chicago, King was looked at as a beacon of hope for some and as a threat to others.
Many of the black politicians who were part of the machine were vehemently opposed to his coming. And so Mayor Daley could kind of lay in the cut and be the statesman and have his minions indicate that Dr. King was not welcome here. And there were black ministers who were also opposed to his coming.
On July 10, 1966, King and the organizers staged a large freedom rally at Chicago's Soldier Field. Afterwards, they led a protest to City Hall. There, the Chicago Freedom Movement placed a list of demands on the door.
That was our demonstration of strength, and created a problem for the establishment because we were growing.
What followed was a tense back and forth.
I've been in many demonstrations all across the South, but I can say that I have never seen, even in Mississippi and Alabama, mobs as hostile and as hate-filled as I've seen in Chicago.
By August, a hard-won agreement was reached. Neither side was satisfied. Some saw the agreement as too much of a compromise. Others saw it as part of a larger strategy.
He worked very hard to get a commitment, and they made some paper commitments, but I don't think it's fair to say that Chicago was a real victory. There was marches and all kinds of activities, but it didn't have the decisive quality that the Southern movement did.
By 1967, King left Chicago, and the Chicago Freedom Movement was disbanded, but their work lived on.
He wasn't that kind of bravado, I'm invincible leader, legitimate kind of leader. I respect it. He very much was aware of his own vulnerability.
No matter where it leads, no matter what abuses it may bring, I'm going to tell the truth.
People saw the assassination of Dr. King as being the killing of some of the hope that they had, of some of the dreams that not only did Dr. King have, but the dreams that they had.
After the word got out nationally and internationally that Dr. King had been assassinated, North Lawndale burned, as did a lot of communities throughout America.
The day after the riots, I was on Roosevelt and Kedzie, and it was just like if you ever seen during the war times how the buildings were just in rubble. You could walk down Roosevelt Road, rocks and stones from buildings being all torn down and things like that. Everybody was just really hurt.
There were people in Chicago, as around the country, who were not quite sure about this black Southern minister. When Dr. King was assassinated, a significant number of people were very ashamed of themselves, that they had not really supported him the way they could have while he was alive. Now, Dr. King's favorite song, one of his favorite songs, was If I Can Help Somebody When I Pass Along, if I can cheer somebody with a word or song, if I can show somebody he's traveling wrong, then my living is not being in vain. When I was at Breadbasket, that was my theme song. And when I came out on Saturday morning, the band played that.
In 1968, Jack McNamara, a Jesuit seminarian, along with 12 college students from Presentation Roman Catholic Church, started the Contract Buyers League.
That's just bringing us to the point where we have to bargain and negotiate on your terms. And I feel that we'll stop the picketing only as soon as we have some people who are satisfied with the deals that they get.
The CBL, building on the work of Mark Sater and the Chicago Freedom Movement, would fight the fraudulent act of contract selling with great success.
Folks in Lawndale, at the north end up there around Flournoy, the 3300 block of Flournoy and Lexington, in that area, they organized this group called the Contract Buyers League to kind of fight this process.
How long have you been doing this sort of picketing?
This sort of picketing we've been doing since January.
And has it had any effect so far?
Yes, we have.
Have any of them actually come down in price?
Yes, they have.
They would have meetings in the basement of Presentation Parish. And of course, folks from the South Side who are also buying houses in the same way began to pick up on this. And so they joined in and came up and would attend the meetings here in North Lawndale as well.
It was estimated that the CBL renegotiated over 400 contracts in North Lawndale. The group became so successful that the FHA took notice. Through courage and determination, many of the discriminatory practices of the FHA and other organizations were reversed. But the effects of decades of unfair housing practices have taken their toll on North Lawndale.
Well, redlining is definitely something that still remains. Basically, what is happening in our inner city neighborhoods, such as North Lawndale, is a lot of people who want to own homes when they apply for a mortgage loan. The zip code is actually used to define the area. When that zip code is entered into a system, the values of those homes are deflated, which then the banks are not really interested in lending because there's not a lot of money in it. The lenders were actually lending to families and communities like North Lawndale, charging them more points to initiate a loan and then more interest on the back end of that loan. A lot of those people then walked away from their homes because they could not afford it. Homeownership is well, for African Americans for sure, it was the way and still is the way to create wealth. Some people would disagree with me on that. But in the African American family, households that own their homes were more stable, for one. And two, most people who live in a community like North Lawndale, actually when they move into that home, they stay there. They do not move around. They don't upgrade, 5 years. So that accumulates a lot of equity. And that equity is used as wealth for that family. Currently, we have a 27% home ownership rate. We need to at least be at the city's average of 51%.
Through the work of new activists, North Lawndale has seen a renewal. New housing, new commercial districts, new hope.
The MLK Fair Housing Exhibit Center was created out of a desire of the community to share with the world the impact of Dr. King's presence in North Lawndale.
Freedom is a hard-won thing. Each generation have to win it and win it again. And so you make progress. We've made progress, but we have not reached a level of parity. We have not reached equality, and we have to keep struggling and fighting and working until that time comes.
I teach with some purpose that the students will grasp their gifts and will understand that they have the possibility of changing society, of making society a better place.
I, look at the Bobby Steeles and the Jane Ramseys, Dr. Calvin Morrison, Congressman Danny Davis, and all that they have championed for us. We have, I believe, the responsibility to do something and make an impact for our world.